The numbers alone are difficult to absorb. More than 350 people confirmed dead. Over 1,000 still missing, feared lost. And among the missing, dozens of foreign tourists, including, according to the reports emerging from the region, a group of Americans cut off and trapped high in the mountains along the border between Nepal and China, in a place that the flood has made almost impossible to reach. In a matter of hours, a wall of water came down out of the high Himalaya, unleashed by the sudden collapse of ice and the bursting of a glacial lake in the peaks above, and it swept through the valleys along the border with a violence that has left one of the deadliest disasters to strike this region in memory. Villages were carried away. A bridge connecting two nations was destroyed. Roads were erased. And scattered through the high, remote valleys, in trekking areas at the peak of the season when foreigners from around the world come to walk among the world's greatest mountains, an unknown number of people are now stranded, trapped, or lost. While a desperate rescue race against time unfolds in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. This is a catastrophe still unfolding as we speak. Its full toll not yet known, its missing not yet found, and behind every number in it is a human being, and a family somewhere waiting for news that may never come. Before we go further, a quick word. Because a lot of people watch these all the way through and forget to subscribe. If you want to follow a story like this properly, as it develops, hit subscribe. It is free, it takes a second, and it makes sure the next update reaches you. So subscribe, stay with me. And now, let us begin. To understand the scale of what has happened, you have to understand where it happened, because the geography is the reason the toll is so high and the rescue is so hard. The border between Nepal and China runs through the highest mountains on the planet, a landscape of towering peaks and impossibly deep, narrow valleys, where the rivers tumble down from the glaciers and torrents, and where every strip of habitable ground is precious. In these valleys, people have built their villages and their towns, clinging to the narrow floors along the rivers, and through them run the routes that connect Nepal and China, the trading posts and border crossings where goods and people move between the two countries. And through them also run the trails that draw visitors from all over the world. Because this is one of the great trekking and mountaineering regions on Earth, a place where at this time of year, in the trekking season, foreigners come in large numbers to walk the high routes and see the greatest mountains in existence. So when the flood came, it came upon a landscape crowded with the vulnerable, the villagers in their homes along the river. The workers and travelers at the border crossings, and the trekkers and tourists scattered through the high valleys, all of them in the path of the water, and all of them in a place where the steep, narrow terrain gives a flood nowhere to spread, and its victims nowhere to run. And the flood, when it came with a suddenness and a force that gave almost no one time to react. This was not a slow flood building over days of rain. It was a sudden, catastrophic release of water from the high mountains, triggered by the collapse of ice and the bursting of a glacial lake, sending a wall of water and debris racing down the valleys with terrible speed. In the narrow confines of the mountain valleys, that wall of water could not spread out and dissipate. Instead, the valley walls channeled it and concentrated it so that it filled the valley floor from side to side, a churning mass of water and rock and mud, tearing away everything in its path. It carried off homes with the people inside them. It swept away the vehicles and the goods staged at the border crossing. It destroyed the bridge that linked Nepal and China, severing the connection between the two countries and cruelly cutting off the very route that rescuers would need to reach the survivors. And it left, in its wake, a scene of devastation stretched across the remote valleys, with the confirmed dead already numbering in the hundreds and the missing far higher, and with the terrible knowledge that many of those missing are in places the rescuers cannot yet reach. Here is where you can help me, and it takes only a second. If you are from Nepal or anywhere in the Himalayan region, or you have family or friends who trek in these mountains, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I read them, and it helps me understand who this story is reaching, and it lets others following this know they are not alone in caring about what is happening here. It costs nothing, and it means more than you would think. Let us talk about the trapped, because this is the part of the story that has drawn the world's attention, and that is, in human terms, the most agonizing. Among the missing and the stranded are foreign tourists, people who had come to this remote and beautiful place to trek and to climb, and who found themselves, without any warning, caught in a catastrophe far from home. According to the reports coming out of the region, a number of them are Americans, along with tourists from other countries, and some are believed to be trapped in the high valleys, cut off by the destruction of the roads and bridges, unable to get out, and difficult for rescuers to get to. Imagine their situation. They came to walk among the mountains, and now they are stranded in those mountains, in an area transformed by disaster, the routes out destroyed, the communications down, waiting to be found and rescued from a place that has become one of the hardest places on earth to reach. Their families, back home in America and in the other countries they came from, are living through the particular agony of knowing their loved ones are somewhere in the disaster zone, but not knowing whether they are alive, not knowing where they are, not knowing when or whether they will be reached. The presence of foreign tourists among the trapped has focused international attention on the catastrophe, and rightly so. But it should not obscure the far larger number of local people, the villagers and the border workers, who make up the great majority of the dead and the missing, and whose loss is no less devastating for being less reported. If this is helping you understand what is actually happening up there, do me two quick favors that keep a channel like this going. Tap the like button so more people see the real story as it develops. And more importantly, share this with anyone in your family who has friends or loved ones trekking in that region right now, because they may not have heard and they need to know. That one share could reach exactly the person who needs it, and it costs you nothing. A like and a share with your family, and then we keep going, because there is more you need to understand about why this happened and what comes next. So what actually caused this sudden wall of water out of a clear season? The answer lies high in the mountains, in the ice and the lakes that sit among the peaks, and in a phenomenon that is one of the most dangerous and least understood threats in all the high mountains of the world. The disaster was triggered by a collapse in the glaciated heights, the sudden failure of ice, and the release of a glacial lake, sending its stored water crashing down into the valleys below. In the high mountains, as the glaciers melt, the meltwater collects in lakes, held back by natural dams of loose rock and ice and debris left behind by the glaciers themselves. These lakes can grow large, holding enormous quantities of water high above the inhabited valleys, held in place only by these fragile natural barriers. And when one of those barriers fails, whether because ice or rock falls into the lake and sends a wave over the dam, or because the dam itself collapses, or because a chunk of the glacier gives way entirely, the lake can empty in minutes, releasing all of its water at once in a sudden, catastrophic flood. This is a glacial lake outburst flood, or a closely related glacial collapse. And it is what came down upon these border valleys, water that had been gathering high in the melting mountains, released in an instant to devastate the communities and the travelers below. And the reason this kind of disaster is becoming more common and more dangerous is the warming of the climate, which is transforming the high mountains faster than almost anywhere on Earth. The Great Mountain Ranges of Asia hold the largest store of ice outside the polar regions, so much that the region is sometimes called the Third Pole, and that ice is melting rapidly as the climate warms, with the warming amplified at these high altitudes. As the glaciers melt, more meltwater collects in more and larger lakes, so that the number and the size of these dangerous lakes has been growing across the high mountains, more and more of them forming among the peaks, each one a potential flood held back by a fragile dam. And the warming also destabilizes the mountains themselves, thawing the frozen ground that once held the slopes and the glaciers together, making the collapses and the dam failures that trigger these floods more likely. So the warming is loading the high mountains with more water and more precarious lakes while making the failures that release them more frequent, a double increase in the danger. And this catastrophe on the Nepal-China border is a direct and terrible expression of that growing threat. One more glacial disaster in a region where they are becoming more common with each passing year. And I know this is the second time I am going to ask, so I will keep it quick. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about following this properly as it unfolds, rather than just glancing at a headline, and that is exactly who I make these videos for. Subscribing is the one small thing that keeps the updates coming. That is all. Now, back to it, because the rescue itself is the part where everything is now being decided. Because right now, as the confirmed toll stands in the hundreds and the missing in the thousands, the entire story hinges on the rescue. And the rescue is a nightmare of the most difficult kind. Consider what the rescuers are up against. The disaster struck a remote, high-altitude region where access was difficult even before the flood, and the flood has made it far worse, destroying the roads and the bridges that would normally carry rescuers and aid into the area, so that the disaster zone is now cut off, reachable only with enormous difficulty. Helicopters have become the lifeline, the only way to reach many of the stranded and to bring out the injured, but helicopter operations in these high mountains are dangerous and weather-dependent, hampered by the terrain and by the conditions, able to fly only when the weather allows, and able to carry only so many at a time. The search for the missing must be conducted across a vast, rugged, dangerous landscape, with the constant threat of further floods and landslides, in terrain where a person could be trapped or lost in 100 places that are hard to see and harder to reach. And above all, there is the pressure of time, because for the missing who are still alive, trapped or injured or stranded, every hour that passes reduces their chances, exposure and injury and the lack of food and water and shelter taking their toll, so that the rescue is a desperate race against the clock. Every hour counting, in conditions that make every hour of progress agonizingly hard to achieve. This is why the outcome is still so uncertain, why the toll could still climb. Because so many of the missing are in places the rescuers are only now, with terrible difficulty, beginning to reach. Try to imagine what it is like for those who are trapped and still alive, waiting somewhere in the high valleys for rescue. They came here in the ordinary way, as travelers, perhaps the trip of a lifetime, to walk among the greatest mountains on earth, and then in a matter of hours, their world was transformed into a disaster zone. The trail they walked in on may be gone, washed away or buried, the bridges they crossed destroyed, the way out simply erased. Their phones may have no signal in the remote valleys, so they cannot call for help or tell their families they are alive, and their families cannot reach them. They may be sheltering in a village that has itself been half destroyed. sharing what little food and shelter remains with local people who have lost everything, or they may be stranded in the open, exposed to the cold and the wet of the high mountains, waiting for a helicopter that can only come when the weather clears. Each of them is a person with a name and a family and a life waiting back home, now suspended in a terrifying limbo, alive but cut off. Safe for the moment, but not yet saved, watching the sky for the sound of rotors and hoping the rescue reaches them before their situation turns from survivable to fatal. This is the reality behind the phrase trapped in the mountains, not an abstraction, but a set of individual human beings enduring an ordeal, and their rescue, or their loss, is being decided right now, hour by hour. In the high valleys of the border, there is a particular anguish in the uncertainty of the numbers, in the vast gap between the confirmed dead and the far larger number of the missing, and it is worth understanding what that gap actually means. When a disaster like this leaves hundreds confirmed dead, but over 1,000 missing, the missing are not yet counted among the dead, but their fate is. In many cases, terribly uncertain. Some of the missing may yet be found alive, trapped or stranded but surviving, and every rescue that brings one of them out is a life saved from the count of the lost. But many of the missing, in a disaster of this violence, will not be found alive, will have been carried away by the water, buried in the debris, lost in places where they may never be recovered. So that the number of the missing is, in the grimmest sense, a measure of how much higher the death toll may yet climb. This is the agony of the aftermath of such a flood, that for days and weeks the true toll remains unknown, the families of the missing suspended in a torment of uncertainty, hoping against hope that their loved one is among the survivors yet to be reached, rather than among the dead not yet found. The gap between the hundreds confirmed and the 1,000+ missing is the space in which that agony lives, and it will only close slowly, name by name, as the rescuers reach the places they cannot yet reach, and the recovery of the lost proceeds through the wreckage. The weather and the timing make the rescue even crueler than it would otherwise be. This is the season when the mountains are most prone to storms and rain, when clouds can close in on the valleys and ground the helicopters that are the only real lifeline to the stranded, so that the rescuers are at the mercy of conditions that can shut down the operation for hours or days at exactly the moments when time matters most. At high altitude, the helicopters can carry less and fly with less margin, the thin air limiting what the aircraft can do, so that even when the weather allows, each flight can bring out only a few people, and the evacuation of hundreds of stranded survivors becomes a slow, agonizing process of trip after trip, hour after hour, while the missing wait. On the ground, the rescuers face terrain that would be dangerous even without a disaster, and now made far worse, with unstable slopes threatening further landslides, with the river still swollen and capable of surging again, with debris and destruction blocking every path. And they must do all of this while the clock runs, knowing that for the trapped and the injured, survival is a matter of time, that the difference between a rescue and a recovery may be measured in hours. It is one of the hardest kinds of rescue operation there is, in one of the hardest environments on Earth, under conditions that fight the rescuers at every turn, and the fact that anyone is being reached at all is a testament to the courage and skill of those flying and climbing into the disaster zone to bring the survivors out. Now step back and see this catastrophe in its larger context, because as devastating as it is on its own, it is also a warning about a threat that hangs over the entire Himalayan region and the vast populations that live below it. There are thousands of glacial lakes scattered across the high mountains of Asia, and as the climate continues to warm and the glaciers continue to melt and collapse. More of these lakes are forming and growing, and a significant number of them are considered dangerous, capable of bursting or collapsing to send floods down into the valleys below. And those valleys are home to enormous numbers of people, communities strung along the rivers that flow down from the mountains, along with the trekkers and climbers and travelers who come to the region in ever greater numbers, all of them sitting, often unknowingly, in the potential path of a glacial flood. This disaster on the Nepal-China border is one lake, one collapse, one catastrophe. But it is not unique, and it will not be the last, because the same forces that produced it, the warming, the melting, the growing and destabilizing lakes, are at work across the entire region, loading more and more of these mountains with the potential for the same kind of sudden, devastating flood. This catastrophe is a preview of a threat that is growing across the roof of the world. And the hundreds dead and the thousands missing here are in the largest sense an early and terrible cost of a danger that is only beginning to reveal its full scale. There is a hard injustice woven through this, which deserves to be said, because the people who suffer most from these disasters are among those who did the least to cause the warming that drives them. The mountain communities of the Himalayan valleys, the villages swept away in this flood, are for the most part poor communities living close to the land, contributing almost nothing to the global emissions that are warming the planet and melting the glaciers above them, and yet they are on the front line of the consequences, among the first and the hardest hit. And even the trekkers and tourists who come from wealthier places are individual people caught in a catastrophe not of their making, drawn by the beauty of the mountains into the path of a danger that the warming has magnified. The flood does not distinguish, taking the local villager and the foreign trekker alike, but the deepest injustice falls on the mountain communities who bear the greatest share of the loss while bearing the least responsibility for the warming that helped cause it. This is one of the recurring cruelties of the changing climate, that its earliest and most severe impacts so often fall on those least responsible, and this border catastrophe is a stark example. A poor mountain region devastated by the meltwater of glaciers, warmed by the emissions of distant, wealthier places. And this is not the first time this exact stretch of border has been struck by a disaster of this kind, which is part of what makes it so alarming. The same region has been hit before by floods carrying the same signature, water surging down from the melting heights on the Tibet side, tearing away the bridges and the crossings that connect the two countries, killing and displacing the people below. When a place is struck once, it can be called a tragic accident, a piece of terrible luck. When it is struck again, by the same mechanism in the same valleys, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, and it stops being an accident and becomes a trend, the visible edge of a changing climate reaching down into the same vulnerable communities again and again. The people of these border valleys are not being unlucky once. They are living in a place where the warming mountains above them keep producing the same catastrophe, and each new flood is another confirmation that this is the new and terrible reality of life beneath these melting peaks. So is there anything that can be done in the face of a threat like this, or must we simply accept a rising tide of these disasters? There is a great deal that can be done, and it is worth ending on the real possibilities, because these catastrophes are not entirely beyond our power to reduce. The dangerous glacial lakes can be identified and monitored using satellites and field surveys to find the ones most likely to burst or collapse and to watch them for signs of failure. Early warning systems can be installed on the most dangerous lakes, sensors that detect the beginning of an outburst and send an alarm down the valley, giving the communities and the travelers below the precious minutes they need to reach high ground. The trekking routes and the settlements can be assessed for their exposure, and travelers can be warned about the areas of greatest risk. And the cross-border cooperation that these shared hazards demand can be built. The sharing of monitoring and warning across the political boundary that the floods themselves ignore, so that a danger high in one country can be watched for the sake of the people it threatens in another. None of this can eliminate the danger, especially as the warming continues to make these floods more frequent. But all of it can reduce the toll, can give people the warning that means the difference between a valley full of the dead and a valley whose people escaped in time. The technology and the knowledge exist. What is needed is the will and the resources and the cooperation to deploy them before the next lake bursts, before the next collapse sends the water down. So as the rescuers push into the high valleys, as the helicopters fly whenever the weather allows, as the families of the missing wait in an agony of uncertainty for word of the ones they love, this catastrophe stands as both a present tragedy and a warning about the future. It is a tragedy first, a real and terrible loss of life, hundreds dead and over 1,000 missing. Entire villages swept away, foreign travelers trapped far from home, a stretch of the border between two nations devastated in hours, and that loss deserves to be mourned and honored and not reduced to a mere statistic or a mere illustration of a larger point. But it is also a warning, a clear and urgent one, about a danger that is growing across the entire roof of the world as the warming climate melts and destabilizes the great glaciers of Asia, filling the high mountains with more and larger lakes held back by more fragile dams, poised above the valleys where hundreds of millions live and where travelers from around the world come to walk. This border catastrophe is what that danger looks like when it strikes, and it will strike again in other valleys, below other lakes, unless the warnings are heeded and the systems are built, and the deeper cause, the warming itself, is confronted. The mountains are changing. The ice that has held its place for thousands of years is melting and collapsing. And the water it releases is coming down into the valleys where people live and travel, in floods like this one, sudden and violent and deadly. The hundreds who have died, and the thousands still missing, and the trapped travelers waiting to be found are the human cost of this one catastrophe, and they are also a message from the melting mountains, a message that the world would be wise to hear before the next flood comes. And so, as the search continues and the toll is still being counted, the least the rest of us can do, watching from far away, is to understand what has happened and why. To recognize that this is not a random act of nature, but the increasingly frequent consequence of a warming world, falling first and hardest on the mountain communities least responsible for it, and catching, this time, travelers from across the globe in its path, to hold in our minds the human reality behind the numbers, the villagers and the border workers and the trekkers, the hundreds already lost, and the thousands whose fate is still unknown, the families waiting for news, and to resolve that the warnings offered by disasters like this one should not be wasted, that the monitoring and the warning systems and the cooperation that could save the next village and the next group of travelers should be built, so that fewer people, local and foreign alike, have to face what these people faced, a wall of water out of the mountains with no warning and no escape. The valleys on the Nepal-China border are a scene of catastrophe tonight, and the mountains above them, warming still, hold more water yet, and more lakes, above more villages and more trails, waiting for the next collapse, the next flood, the next terrible descent of the water that the melting heights can no longer hold. Until then, the mountains keep their watch, and the water keeps gathering, and the valleys below wait, unknowing, for the next descent.